Hello, my name is Brett. My wife and I own Bluebird Pharmacy and Spa, and we gave an in-store presentation several weeks ago on the topic of CBD, focusing on how you can work with your doctor and pharmacist to minimize CBD drug interactions. It was well received, but several of our customers were unable to make it that evening and asked us to put together a screencasting version of this that we could post online. That's what we're doing in this presentation. It won't have the same interactive component that the in-store talk had, but we hope that it will provide some value to you. You'd have to be living under a rock these days not to notice that CBD is widely available from an increasing number of locations. Just a few weeks ago, my local gas station started selling it. And if you look online with a few keystrokes, you can find probably hundreds of different sources. The outline of the presentation will be first a general background on CBD, and then we want to spend much of the talk talking about how CBD can interact with prescription medications. There's some research out there that addresses this, and we don't think that it's been discussed that much in much of the material that's available online. And then finally, we'll discuss the advantages of working with both doctors and pharmacists while you're taking CBD. Lots of dog breeds out there, and some pretty cool ones. The Corgi and the Dalmatian. The reason I show this slide is that all of these are the same species, different varieties of Canis lupus. In the same vein, we're going to be talking about different varieties of cannabis sativa. There's the hemp that has less than 0.3% THC, and then there's marijuana that has greater than 0.3% THC, but they are the same species, cannabis sativa. And two of the substances, the cannabinoids, chemicals that are in these plants, are the ones that are most discussed. THC is one and CBD is the other. THC is the intoxicating component, and CBD is not intoxicating, yet it does have impacts on the body. One thing that you need to be careful with when you're doing online searches on CBD from various websites is that there are a lot of claims out there that are not based in solid science yet. You can probably find that CBD cures just about everything online. What are the facts? Well, there is anecdotal evidence that suggests that CBD might have a role in addressing pain, inflammation, anxiety, and sleep, but these are just anecdotes, and as of yet, they don't have the clinical research backing them up, although you will find some people with some very strong opinions on that, and some individuals that will say CBD greatly helped me with these issues. What is the research that has a bit stronger support is CBD's role in addressing seizures. And we'll talk about some of the journal articles that lay out this research. CBD and THC have similar yet different shapes. The chemical structure of the two varies like two different keys, and these keys fit in certain locks and cause things to happen. So the chemicals CBD and THC bond to receptors on the surface of cells in your body and cause certain things to occur. Different shapes connect with different receptors. The receptors that we're talking about are associated with the human endocannabinoid system. You have many of these receptors distributed throughout your body, and you produce cannabinoids that bond to the receptors, interact with them directly or indirectly, and cause various things to happen. Plant-based cannabinoids like CBD and THC from hemp also influence these receptors. This slide shows the number of different locations that receptors of the human endocannabinoid system are in your body, and it speaks to the potential of if CBD interacts with receptors in all these different locations, it speaks to the potential of perhaps CBD can have a positive influence on a wide range of conditions, and that in part explains some of the excitement around CBD. Let's take some time to discuss some of the clinical research that addresses the therapeutic effects of CBD, and these studies deal with conditions that have seizures. The first article that we'll discuss is in the New England Journal of Medicine, and you'll see that both of the articles we'll be talking about are from top 5 premier medical journals. You don't get published in these if you have shoddy research, and both of these have what's the gold standard of medical research, this randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled structure. And you see that they had a good sample size of 120 patients, and they split them amongst 2 groups. One received CBD and one received placebo. And after the course of the trials, they compared the seizure frequency, and they noted that the CBD group had a significantly greater reduction in seizure frequency. The next article is from an equally prestigious publication, The Lancet, and it had a similar structure, randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled. They also had a good sample size of patients split amongst the 2 groups, the treatment group receiving CBD and the control group receiving the placebo. And once again, we had a greater reduction in seizure frequency. The FDA looked at these types of research and was convinced to approve a prescription version of CBD called Epidiolex. And notice that this was not that long ago, just June of 2018, that this occurred. We want to discuss the big picture here, not only the benefits of CBD, but we want to be aware of the potential negative effects. This publication put out by the World Health Organization helps to address that. And this quote is relevant. CBD is generally well tolerated with a good safety profile. That sounds good. Reported adverse effects may be as a result of drug-drug interactions between CBD and patients' existing medication. And it's that second sentence that we want to delve a little deeper in this presentation and try to figure out what that means. And let's do that now with the second part of the talk. How can CBD interact with prescription medication? And what does that mean if it's interacting with prescription medication? The first question to consider is you look at the side of a prescription bottle and it says take 1 tablet once daily or twice daily or whatever it is for that particular medication and what your doctor has prescribed, why is it multiple times? Why can't you just take one pill and be done with it? Wouldn't that be nice? And the reason you need to take pills periodically is that you have enzymes in your body, many produced by the liver, that are breaking down these medications. This is similar to when someone consumes alcohol. The alcohol produces some effects in the body, but those effects don't linger for too long because after a couple hours, the enzymes in your body break down the alcohol so that it no longer has the same effect. In that same way, we can look at a drug that you might take, like warfarin, a widely prescribed medication. It enters the body, and enzymes in the liver will start to break it down into inactive versions that are eliminated in your urine. There are many enzymes that we'll be talking about. They have fancy names, and there's a shorthand for many of these. This one particular enzyme is CYP2C9, and we'll be talking about others. But enzymes break down the medication, eliminate it from the body, and you need to take an additional pill to keep higher levels of medication that can have a therapeutic effect. The next thing to consider is, what if something interfered with the enzyme so that it didn't work as well and didn't break down the drug as quickly? This figure shows what happens normally if the enzyme's working fine. You take the pill, the levels of the drug in your body increase, but then the enzymes of your liver start breaking that drug down. And over time, you have a decrease of the levels of the drug in your body. And the next day, you take the medication again, and the levels go back, and you ideally stay in this therapeutic range for drug concentration. And at those levels, it helps address whatever condition you are trying to help. Now, what if the medication is not being broken down by the enzyme in the typical way? What if something is interfering with how well the enzyme works? And to help discuss that, we'll bring in Anna, our head pharmacist, to help me with a little demonstration.
Hello, everyone.
This is Anna, our co-owner and head pharmacist. She's going to take a break from her compounding to help me with this high-tech demonstration that we're going to do. And this pill bottle with the base and the cap represents the active medication. When it is taken apart, that shows that it's inactive. What we're going to do is take our pill periodically. It goes into our body, and then the enzyme with two hands, Anna represents the enzyme, will break it down. We'll take another pill the next time, and you see that the medication is being broken down and it does not accumulate to high levels in the body. Now the question is, what if something interferes with how well this enzyme works? And we're going to represent that by having the enzyme hold one hand behind her back. Now we're going to repeat the demonstration with the enzyme only able to use one hand. We're going to take our medication and she's going to break it down. We'll take our next medication and she'll break it down. And we continue to take our medications periodically. And the enzyme is working, thank you, at a less efficient rate, and the amount of medication accumulates in the body, and that can cause negative side effects. All right, with that, let's go back to our original figure and add a few more layers of detail. Remember, this center line was what happens normally, and if the enzyme isn't working as well as was shown in that demo, what can happen is that the levels of the drug accumulate in the body because it's not being eliminated, broken down and eliminated, and it can actually reach toxic levels and will eventually decrease as the enzyme is working at a slower rate. It can eventually break down the drug. But exceeding the therapeutic range and getting into the toxic range is one thing that we want to avoid. So to summarize here, we have many liver enzymes that are breaking down prescription drugs. And one group, cytochrome P450, contains about 50 different enzymes that do a lot of this breaking down of the medications. Of all the CYP450 enzymes, there's one that we'll focus on that has a role in breaking down about 30% of all prescription medications. So you can see that if you're taking something that interferes with how well that particular enzyme works, it can affect how many prescriptions could work. Let's explore that in a little more detail. Drug interactions, you might not have ever heard of them, or you might have heard of grapefruit or something else. Grapefruit is one that most people, or many people, have heard about. You might have seen a sticker on the side of a prescription bottle that advises you not to consume grapefruit or the juice while you're taking the medication. You might have wondered why exactly that is. And this figure will help us walk through that. The proper dose is on the left here, and the width of the green line indicates the amount of drug in the body. If you're taking that proper dose and you also take grapefruit juice, that could block enzymes that are involved in breaking down that medication, leading to too much drug in the body, causing problems. We can look at that in a slightly different way, a little more specific. We have the proper dose of the medication, we have the grapefruit juice, and of those many CYP450 enzymes, we'll focus on CYP3A4. And this is one of the enzymes that grapefruit interacts with, and it will allow us to set up our story. And this leads to too much drug in the body. And you can probably figure out where we're going with this story. We have the proper dose of the medication, and this time we're taking CBD, and yes, it's that same enzyme, CYP3A4, that CBD interacts with, and this can lead to too much medication in the body. Now let's look at a case report to dive into this a little bit more. This is from 2008. And it dealt with this widely prescribed medication, warfarin, which is an anticoagulant, which prevents, in at-risk individuals, harmful blood clots. A blood clot might form and then move into the brain and cause a stroke. And people take warfarin to reduce the risk of that. But on the flip side, too much suppression of or interfering with the clotting response could lead to dangerous bleeding. Taking a look at their data, I'll point you to two things. On the y-axis on the left side, we have the CBD dose, and the y-axis on the right side, we have the something called an iron R value and warfarin dose. will be referring to each of those. The INR value, those that take warfarin are probably familiar with this. It's we'll call it an index of how quickly the blood clots. If your INR value is 1, that is the clotting of a normal person. And if your INR value is 2 to 3, that is a reduced clotting compared to a normal person, but that's acceptable level for at-risk individuals because it will prevent that risk of a clot forming and causing a stroke. But if you reduce the clotting ability too much and your INR value increases to above 3, that is an unacceptably high risk of bleeding. Looking at the data for this case study then, we have an individual that was monitored. He had some cardiac surgery and he was also suffering from some seizures. You see that over some months they had monitored the individual and they had been giving him a consistent dose of warfarin, and they were looking at this INR value. Notice that for those several months, his INR value was within that acceptable range of 2 to 3. Notice also that the CBD level was 0 for these initial months. This is what's valuable from this study, in that they did some background monitoring before they added the CBD. Now, what happens when they gave the individual CBD? You see that when the dose of CBD was added, there was a corresponding increase in the INR value. Remember, 2 to 3 is acceptable, and this INR value spiked to nearly 7. So that is a dangerous risk of bleeding. The doctors have a few options at this point to pull down the INR value. One would be to eliminate what caused it to increase. They could have stopped giving the CBD. But remember that this person was suffering seizures. Part of this study was to see if the CBD would relieve those seizures and reduce the risk of the seizures. So they chose not to do that. The other thing they can do to reduce that dangerously high risk of bleeding is to reduce the dose of warfarin. And you see that is what they did. They reduced the warfarin dose, and that brought down the INR value to within this 2 to 3 level. And they ultimately ended up bringing the warfarin dose down a couple notches, and that allowed the patient to have the combination of CBD to address the seizures and the warfarin at acceptable levels to reduce the risk of clotting and stroke. Just looking at this INR from a different side, 2 to 3 is the range of INR for the at-risk individuals. If you have an INR of 1 and you're an at-risk individual, that can lead to clotting, that can lead to a stroke. But if you interfere with the clotting mechanism too much, you could lead to dangerous bleeding. Continuing on with this, we have millions and millions of prescriptions of warfarin written each year, and the question arises, Over the past few years, now that CBD has become available, how many of those individuals that are taking warfarin have decided to buy some CBD online or at their local gas station and are experimenting themselves with dosing to try to address something, whether it's sleep or anxiety or something like that. And importantly, they haven't told their doctor or pharmacist that they're taking this, and they're not being monitored for a potentially negative interaction. And that's just warfarin. Warfarin is just one example of a medication that is broken down by some of these liver enzymes. Here's the liver enzyme CYP3A4, and this is a partial list of the medications that this enzyme is responsible for breaking down. So you can see that if you're taking something like CBD that interferes with how well this enzyme works, it could lead to elevated levels of these drugs and some potential negative interactions. And that's only part of the story because that's just one enzyme. Remember, there are multiple enzymes that are involved in breaking down these prescriptions. And CBD, for instance, interacts with not just CYP3A4, but also several other of these liver enzymes, as does THC. So the things are getting a little more complex, and we're not even going to get into the fact that each individual differs genetically, and that affects the version of a particular enzyme they have and how much of that enzyme is produced, and that can further complicate and make it difficult to predict the response of an individual to a drug. All of this reinforces the idea that it's best to work with a medical professional if you're taking substances that may affect how well these liver enzymes work. And this table shows some of the other scientific studies that have looked at how CBD affects some of these liver enzymes that are responsible for breaking down prescription drugs. Keep in mind, however, that it's only been the past couple years that there's been a huge increase in the number of people taking CBD. So in the ensuing years, there'll probably be a number of additional publications documenting CBD drug interactions. Now let's go to the third stage of the talk, laying out the advantages of working with the medical professional. If you've been following the news reports recently over the past several months, you've seen too many of these sorts of tragic reports. This particular instance is of a young man who was vaping what he thought was a CBD product, but it actually had synthetic marijuana in instead, and the combination of the vaping led to serious consequences. And this has happened in many individuals, and some young people have lost their lives or have had severe medical complications as a result. Other news reports have summarized some studies that have purchased a variety of CBD products online and then tested them to see what was actually in the bottles compared to what was on the label. And some of the results are not encouraging and they are problematic. One of the groups that researched this was Legit Scripts, and they ordered a number of CBD products and sent them to the lab to be tested to see what was in them. To the left of this center line shows individual products that had less CBD in the bottle than was claimed on the label, and to the right of the midline are products that had more CBD than was listed on the label. For this particular product, for instance, it had less than 90% of the CBD that was claimed on the label. You're certainly not getting your money's worth there. On the flip side, this particular product had 90% more CBD than was listed on the label. You might initially think, wow, I'm getting my money's worth there. I'm getting more than I'm paying for. But if you keep in mind the possibility of the dose of CBD affecting how well your enzymes work and complicating your existing prescriptions, not being able to know how much CBD is actually in the bottle could be a problem. We carry a couple brands of CBD in our store that we feel are high quality. One of them is a CBD isolate, and the other combines CBD with some of the other cannabinoids that are present in hemp. We can answer some questions on these products, but keep in mind if you bring in other products, we're not going to be able to know for sure what's in those brands, particularly given some of the problematic test results. So we won't be able to address questions with those products. One thing nice about these higher quality products is they send the samples out for independent laboratory testing. This is an example of a test certificate. In this case, it was a CBD isolate, so you'd want to see only CBD in that particular product, and that's what you see, and you see an absence of THC, which in this case is what the customer is looking for. These tests also look for the presence of other problematic components like bacteria, heavy metal, and pesticide. One of the previous test studies found that in these samples purchased online, in a few of the samples there were worrisomely high levels of heavy metals, which is certainly problematic. The CBD boom is young. Just 3 years ago, things were completely different. CBD wasn't everywhere. And what caused the change, and that was this 2018 Farm Bill that shifted the legal and political dynamics that led to the widespread availability of CBD. And this is important because since people haven't been taking CBD for that long, there hasn't been a lot of time for researchers and doctors to identify how CBD affects these various medications. And over the next several years, we will accumulate more information of how CBD interacts with these different drugs, and that will add to our understanding. And probably 5 or 10 years from now, there'll be a number of additional publications that say we found that CBD interacts with this medication, and we suggest that doctors adjust the dosing of those medications in this way to address that. And it speaks to the benefit of working with a medical professional who can monitor you and see if there's a drug interaction taking place. And pharmacists are well suited to this, as they are quite skilled in looking for drug-drug interactions. And your doctor is also well suited to follow you as you take your CBD. And this applies not only to CBD, but remember, multiple prescription drugs can interact with negative consequences, and supplements like St. John's wort and others can have unexpected effects on your prescriptions. Let's return to this quote that we saw earlier. We had spent some time now talking about how CBD can interact with certain medications, and it's something you want to keep an eye on with your pharmacist and your doctor. But let's point out again that, as this report says, CBD is generally well tolerated with a good safety profile. So we want to keep that in mind. Also, risk is relative. It depends on what you're comparing CBD with. Some of the medications that people have been taking are very high risk. And anybody that's been following this tragic opioid epidemic knows that certain medications can be quite problematic. Hundreds of thousands of individuals have died from the opioid epidemic. Questions that are raised are, could CBD be a safer alternative to address some conditions? And if you can take CBD and it addresses a condition you're dealing with and allows you to wean yourself from medications of greater risk, that would be a good thing. These are areas that researchers are going to want to follow as additional information is collected on the pros and cons of CBD. So we'll need to stay tuned for that. Thank you for your attention. We hope that you found some value in this presentation, and we hope that we were successful in presenting this material in a straightforward and useful way. At this point, we'd like to invite you into Bluebird Pharmacy and Spa. We carry a couple different CBD products, and we work with our ongoing patients to minimize the risk of a CBD drug interaction. We are located in Ponte Vedra, Florida, halfway between the communities of Nocatee and Palencia along US 1. Thank you and have a good one.